Welcome everybody, my name is John Duffy and I'm a student at Columbus State University, and today I'm going to discuss some cross-cultural psychology topics, specifically diagnostic and classification considerations across cultures. Some of the topics I'm going to discuss today are going to include collectivist and individualist societies, defining them and comparing them, cultural impacts on perception and cognition, limitations of the DSM-V and the ICD-10, specifically in reference to Western bias diagnostic systems, the adequacy of these particular diagnostic tools in Western cultures, and their significant inadequacy in collectivist Eastern cultures. And of course, we're going to discuss the need for improvement of the ICD-10 in order for it to be truly generalized across cultures. Collective versus individual characteristics and their comparative. In a collectivist society, we're going to see a placement of the needs and goals of the in-group ahead of the individual's needs and goals. That's not so in an individualist society, where there is a placement of the needs and goals of the individual ahead of the needs and goals of the in-group. In collectivist societies, there's usually quite a lot of tradition and a lot of well-enforced rules and an authoritarian structure. Whereas in an individualist culture, there's going to be more openness to new experiences, it's going to be more democratic, and it's going to, basically the in-group is not as important as the individual. In collectivist groups, we're going to see a tighter in-group relationships between members of the in-group. There will be some rejection of outside groups or people from outside areas, and there's a lot of rigidity in regards to conformity to the norms. In an individualist society, it's a lot more loose. In fact, a lot of people, especially those in collectivist societies, would see them as superficial or fake relationships. Collectivism is a very in-group centered concept. And of course, assertive and outgoing ideas and outgroup, not necessarily outgroup, but individual based or centered needs. Culture has an impact on perception and cognition, and for many years, decades, anthropologists and psychologists and sociologists and so on have been referring to two primary cultural categories. One being of Western values, which includes working hard, achieving for the self, striving for efficiency, consumption of material goods, and competitiveness. In non-Western values, the values of the Western culture are still there, but they're not as critical. They don't take front stage. For non-Western values, we have a respect for tradition, a reverence of authority, and an overall stability. There's also a very, 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 very well-enforced conformity to the norms. Culture has an impact on perception. Western and non-Western cultures tend to divide along the lines of collectivism and individualism, but there's not really a line there, because they are opposite ends of a continuum. When it comes to collectivism and individualism, there's some gray. In fact, not only is there gray, there's shades of gray from one culture to another. It's a little bit of both. A little less of this, a little more of that, and so on. Moves it back and forth on this spectrum of this continuum. The values and social behaviors related to a culture depends basically on the locus along that continuum. Where do they plot along that line? What shade of gray do they possess? Cultural norms and practices are very much different from one culture to another, and this affects diagnostic and treatment issues when it comes to psychotherapy and so on. What is most important here is that what is normal behavior for one is abnormal behavior for another, and we're speaking in concepts of, or in the idea of cultures. Culture has an impact on cognition, how we think. Individual thought process is affected by culture. Not only that, but there's a collective kind of thinking when it comes to collectivist societies. Every individual in the entire world is socialized, meaning that they are raised into a particular culture, its norms, practices, traditions, and beliefs. And they consider things differently than members in other cultures because of these differences in norms and practice and belief. This often affects, it has a huge impact on how one group views another. For instance, in Eastern cultures, they take time to think about things a little bit more. They're a little bit slower on coming up with a decision. And in individualist societies, we're going to see a lot more right now, make a decision or else. For individualist perspectives, a collectivist who takes his time in deciding can be considered suspicious. What's he up to? Why isn't he just giving me an answer? And in other cases, they may even consider them dumb. And I think in some cases, when it comes to this particular clash, this particular perspective clash, I think that gave a great deal of reinforcement to racist beliefs in the past. Because in individualist societies, they're expecting an answer right now. You need to think on the go. And in collectivist cultures, they don't do that. They take time to evaluate things, discuss things, come up with a decision, because they are concerned with the effects of the overall group. That may have led to our predecessors in the past from Europe thinking that, well, Asians are just stupid. Why can't they come up with a decision? Of course, that's not true, but I sometimes think that was a huge contribution to racist thinking. So anyway, this often affects how one group views another and how they interact with each other, how they deal with each other. Can you see how fast a diplomatic issue can arise out of these two different ways of thinking? An individual from one culture who is immersed in another culture, a culture that's foreign to that individual, may not think or process information the same as the members of the host culture. And in this case, again, the people in the host culture may think they're weird. But what they're doing, they think is normal. Because remember, what's normal for one group is abnormal for another. Now this, of course, impacts diagnostic and treatment greatly. And it has to be considered by practitioners, but not only by practitioners, but by the manuals and procedures that we put in place. There are some limitations of the DSM-5 that are rather unfortunate. Disorder in the DSM-5 and the DSM-4-TR, its predecessor version, the disorder itself, or the term disorder, is defined well. And it's defined basically along the lines of a behavior that causes distress in the individual and some form of social inhibition or dysfunction. That can be applied across cultures, but that's about it, because the diagnostic checklist and the diagnostic criteria that are listed in the DSM are very useful in the United States, Canada, and Great Britain, but are almost useless in China and Malaysia and Bangladesh and the Philippines. Patient diagnostics, in other words, for non-Western cultures is not possible through the DSM-5 because it simply does not consider what is designated as disorder in those cultures. Plus, there are certain behaviors that exist as normal and abnormal in each of these cultures that don't exist at all in other cultures, and they need to be considered as well. The therapist then is left with only two things. The definition of disorder, now this is specifically to using the DSM-5, the definition of disorder and his or her understanding of the cultural context in which the patient originates and lives in. And these are two things. You can originate from one culture and be socialized by that culture and exist in another. So you have to understand both. Now the ICD-10, which is very similar to the DSM-5, is created by the United Nations instead of the American Psychological Association like the DSM. The World Health Organization, a subunit of the United Nations, developed it. It was developed in 1994, and the diagnostic elements of the ICD-10 are based, unfortunately, almost entirely on the DSM-4 and the 4-TR. This makes the ICD-10 obviously less applicable across cultures, but it's supposed to be international. But it's not. And it's not because it depends so much on Western definitions. Now, just like the DSM, the limitations of the ICD lie along the lines of the ISD or ICD-10 is very accurate in Western cultures. It's very useful in Western Europe, for instance. But try to apply that in Malaysia. Try to apply that in Singapore or wherever. And you're going to find that it's not very useful. Now there are some other issues. Universalism and relativism, and the central peripheral approaches, or ways of viewing psychopathology. Two approaches, of course, non-Western and Western culture disorder and psychopathology. There's two ways of covering it. One is the concept of a central and peripheral symptomology, and I should have mentioned this second, because I'll explain why in just a minute. But one is, this particular concept is my favorite. I think it is more applicable, I think it is more accurate in describing pathology across cultures than any other way. Of course, the other option is the more rigid and dichotomous view of general disorder, which would be a universalist theory that applies, meaning that all disorder is universal across humanity regardless of culture. And then there's relativist theory, which believes that disorder is relative to the cultural context in which the behavior occurs and the consequences for the behaving party. Now, the reason I said that these should have been flipped around is because I believe there was some evolution here, some academic and research evolution in cross-cultural psychology here. Because if you marry universalist and relativist together, you come up with this central and peripheral symptomology concept, meaning that there are certain central diseases and disorders that exist across humanity regardless of cultural norms or cultural context. These would include the results of traumatic brain injury or some form of chromosomal disease. But then beyond that, there are cultural specific elements to diagnosing disorder, or what comprises disorder. Again, what's normal in one culture is abnormal in another. So these create the peripheral elements, and the peripheral elements are culture specific. Now let's compare the particular approaches here. The central peripheral process shows that the central is first looked at. These are the ones that are humanity-wide and applicable and exist in all cultures, or virtually all cultures. And then you go from there to looking at the specific peripheral elements, meaning what cultural context is the individual in, and what cultural context does the individual come from, and how is this creating distress and dysfunction in the cultural context that the person finds himself in. Of course, on the other hand, is this dichotomous, one way or the other, universalist versus relativist, which I completely don't agree with. I think it's more along the lines of central peripheral. I think that's a more accurate way of looking at how disorder is seen from one culture to another, and how diagnostic and treatment options can be shaped from one culture to another so that it is effective. To the ICD-10, I have some suggestions here. Obviously, these improvements, in order for it to be truly international, these improvements are essential. It has got to be made more universal, more applicable across cultures. One of these ways is that the central peripheral approach should be applied here. And what I mean by that is that there should be a main ICD manual, and that should contain diagnostics and treatment options and data on central symptomology, things that would result from traumatic brain injury, disease, poisoning, so on, biological elements that go across cultures regardless of culture. Supplemental to that should be peripheral submanuals that are specific to particular cultural regions. And this would allow for the incorporation of Eastern and Western and everything in between. And then you have a diagnostic and treatment process tool that is truly international, truly cross-cultural, and truly helpful to humanity, regardless of where he or she finds it, where it finds itself. Now, to illustrate what I'm speaking about, or what I'm suggesting here, is that the ICD-10 should have a main manual, and this deals with central diagnostic criteria, stuff that is seen in every culture, and human beings across cultures, and virtually all of them, not all of them, but virtually all of them. Then we want to get into the supplementals thing, and what you see below here is supplementals for East Asia, supplemental for Middle East, and a supplemental for Africa. But there would be many, many, many more, and each of these would actually be quite thick because there's so many different cultural elements. There are also behavioral disorders and accepted behaviors that do not exist in other cultures that need to be identified and considered for that specific cultural area. I recommend highly all of these particular books because they're very useful in understanding cross-cultural psychology, specifically in the area of practicing psychotherapy. One of these books is Cross-Cultural Psychology, Basic Processes in Human Development. Very good book. Cross-Cultural Psychology by Sharif and David Levy. And, of course, Understanding Cross-Cultural Psychology. Human Behavior in Global Perspective is essential. I believe that everybody should be going through this book because it talks about behavior as it's defined and how it's practiced or exercised in specific cultures around the world. Well-being Research in South Africa is a good read because it kind of gives you an idea of what a supplemental manual to the main manual in an ICD-CP format would be. And of course, Multicultural Psychology, the Encyclopedia of Multicultural Psychology is a plus for anybody who likes or is interested or caught in a cross-cultural dilemma. Of course, the IACCP, the International Association of Cross-Cultural Psychologists, is a great organization to not only be a member of, but it has a tremendous amount of published resources that you can use and reference in regards to psychopathology across cultures. References that support a lot of what was discussed. If you would like a more detailed list, I'll be more than happy to email one for you. Just email me at Duffy, D-U-F-F-E-Y, _John at columbusstate.edu, and I will get you the details as fast as I can. Thank you for listening to me. Again, this is John Duffy with Columbus State University, and I thank you for giving me a few minutes of your time.